So today we're going to cover abortion. Usually people, think about abortion in terms of like the pro-life side versus the pro-choice side. And they probably think about it in terms of like, does the fetus, have a right to life, or is the fetus a person maybe? The philosophic debate's going to try and go a little bit beyond that. So we're going to try and jump into that today. First, we're going to start with a little bit of history about abortions. So abortions might seem like a modern medical procedure, but they've actually been around since ancient times. There's even an Aristotle quote about them. Let there be a law that no deformed child shall live. Wow, that's pretty strict. And if couples have children in excess, let abortion be the procedure before life and sense has begun. So he's like, if they have a lot of children, it's okay to abort it before the life has begun in the womb. But also, devices and substances used for abortions were talked about in the Hippocratic Oath. What's interesting, though, where it's not really talked about is in the Hebrew and Christian scripture. It's not explicitly forbidden, and neither does it talk about the fetus being a person. Right after the Ten Commandments, where they're prescribing the punishment for, someone who's a murderer, in Exodus chapter 21, verse 22, it says, if a man causes a miscarriage in a woman, but he doesn't cause any harm to the woman, the penalty should just be a fine. It's, not the same as murder. So they didn't look at, death of the fetus as the same thing as murder, at least back then. But today Roman Catholic Church is very staunchly anti-abortion. They're, famously that way, but they haven't always been that way. This position really came around in the late 19th century. Before that, the church believed, like Aristotle, that, a fetus needed to be formed in order to have a soul. Thomas Aquinas pretty much took everything from Aristotle and just Christianized it. And so he pretty much believed the same thing. He specified, though, for men it was 40 days, and for women it was 90 days. And I think it was because of a woman's an incompletely developed man, or I forget, but definitely some sexism going on there. And then although it was considered a sin in some way, just like harming someone is a sin, it wasn't considered the same thing as murder. Okay, so let's look at the history and the law. So the American law generally comes from English common law. So in English common law, the abortion was considered a crime if it was committed after quickening. So this is when the mother first detects movement inside of her. And then early American laws were the same way. Early 1800s, they outlawed abortions after quickening, and they also explicitly made the exception for, to save the mother's life. Over time, these laws became more strict. The medical community, started to support stricter laws, and their words were taken, much more seriously. And then it wasn't until around the 1950s that we started having more liberal laws around abortions. In the 1970s, the American Medical Association and the American College of OBGYN officially advocated for less severe restrictions on abortions. And then accumulated about 3 years later in Roe versus Wade, in which Roe versus Wade in 1973, in which access to abortion was made legal before viability. Okay, so in order to understand abortion, we need to first understand what pregnancy is and how a human fetus develops over time. So before we had, a bad understanding of human development, but now we think we have a pretty good one. It's at least more complete and more accurate than it was before. Fertilization is the conception where the sperm penetrates the egg. This forms a single cell zygote. That's what it's known as. This doesn't happen in the uterus. This happens in the fallopian tubes. And then over the next 3 to 5 days, the zygote travels down the fallopian tubes, and it's continuing to divide along the way. So then, by the time it gets to the uterus, it's now just like a hollow sphere. This is called a blastocyst. The blastocyst then becomes implanted within the uterine wall, which is then when it becomes known as an embryo. So from the moment of conception to about 8 weeks is the embryo phase. During this phase, the embryo develops in internal organs, such as their brains, the spinal cord, rudimentary limbs, such as their ears. But at the same time, it's still just the size of about a raspberry, so not very big. From about 8 weeks to birth is when it's technically known as a fetus. Around 14 weeks is when we can determine the sex of the fetus. At 16 to 20 weeks, the mother can feel the fetus moving inside of her. So this is, when we used to think quickening was. And now we know that, it's not really a major sign of development happening. There were probably undetected movements that were, happening inside the mother before quickening. A more meaningful benchmark is known as viability. This is at 23 to 24 weeks when the fetus can technically survive outside the mother, although it's at severe risk of, disabilities. So a pregnancy is, going to last 40 months. This is going to be not 40 months. That'll be way too long. That'll be what, 5 years? No, that'd be 60 months. Anyway, a few years. No. So a pregnancy, we all know, lasts about 9 months, 40 weeks, and this is calculated from the woman's last menstrual cycle. So I guess the one in which she missed. So it might be almost 10 months since you missed your last cycle till when you actually give birth. Interesting. So this is usually divided into trimesters: the first 3 months, the middle 3 months, and then the last 3 months, the middle trimester and the late trimester. Premature babies are usually still born in the 3rd trimester, but that's any baby born before 37 weeks. So my sister was actually a preemie baby, and it was sad. She had to be in the ICU for a while. She was in a little incubator, but even still, when she was safe and she came home, she didn't fit into normal clothes, so they actually had to put her in Cabbage Patch outfits. That's my sister, Molly. Yeah. So that is what pregnancy is, and an abortion is going to be the ending of any kind of pregnancy. So there are 3 kinds of abortions. You can have a spontaneous abortion. These are usually called miscarriages. This is going to happen due to natural causes. Induced abortions, these are going to be intentionally terminated pregnancies through drugs or surgery. And then therapeutic abortions. These are going to be abortions performed to save the mother's life. The last ones are usually considered morally permissible, but we'll get into that as we go. So there are 2 main methods to abortions. There's the surgical abortion. So before the 12th week, a doctor has to insert a tube into the opening in the cervix and suctions out the contents. After week 12, they have to dilate the cervix, and then they have to use the suction, but also forceps to extract the fetus and the placenta. A little more gross, but it is what it is, and it's how it happens. So then that was surgical abortions. Now we have medical abortions or medication abortions. This is a 2-step regimen. So mifepristone, I think I'm saying that right, and misoprostol. So you take those in a 2-step regimen. So this only works for abortions within the first 7 to 9 weeks of pregnancy. So misoprostone, that's going to interfere with the hormone progesterone, which is going to cause a thinning of the uterine lining and prevent implantation if it hasn't already happened. And then misoprostol prompts the uterus to be contracted and forces the embryo out. So this is successful at aborting the fetus 95% of the time. These also have very low risks. Early abortions, about 1% of women experience complications. Late abortions, it's about 2% of women experience complications. And of course, with the surgical procedures, there's always a risk of death. about 1 in 100,000 die during a surgical abortion. I imagine those are going to be later term abortions anyway, where it's more serious, and but yeah, it can happen nonetheless. So this is it's not to say it's without harm, but also childbirth itself is 10 times more harmful. So I guess probably 1 in about 10,000 deaths in childbirth. I think that it probably adds up. Okay, so I'm just thinking back to the healthcare stats and what the death rates were there. But okay, so who's getting abortions? So there is about half of all abortions are for women under the age of 25, and about 1/5 of these are teenagers. 75% of abortions are performed on women who have never been married. 17 are for married women, and 16% are on women who have been separated or divorced or widowed. So reasons for getting an abortion, the largest percentage, this was a survey done, and so the largest percentage of women respondents who were getting an abortion said that a baby would change their current life. It interferes with education, employment, etc. 74% of women cited that reason. They can't afford it, they're currently unmarried, they're unemployed, or they're destitute. That is 73% of women said that's a reason why they were getting an abortion. Obviously, these add up to more than 100%. I imagine you have more than one reason why you might be getting an abortion, so I'm sure women gave more than one reason. So 48% of women said, I don't want to be a single mother, or I'm having current relationship problems. 11% said their relationship or marriage was about to end. 38% said they had already completed their childbearing age. I guess, that's a later in life pregnancy, maybe had an oopsie baby, and, you didn't really want to have a child. You were done raising children at that point in your life. 14% said that their husband or partner wants to have an abortion or wanted them to have an abortion. 13% said there was a possible side effect to the fetus. 12% said it was a physical problem for their health. And 1% said that they were getting an abortion because they were a victim of rape. And less than 0.5% said it was a pregnancy due to incest. So rape and incest are often cited as okay reasons for getting abortions, and that accounts for about maybe 1.5% of the reasons people are getting an abortion. So not very much. But then also the woman's health, that was about 13%, and health to the fetus was 13%, and health to the woman was about 12%. So yeah, there's the definitely okay reasons for having an abortion is low response rate there. I thought that was interesting. Okay, so on to the legal struggle now. So the question about legal access to abortion in America really was answered by the Supreme Court decision Roe versus Wade. So this was started in Texas. A Texas woman, Norma McCorvey, she got the pseudonym Jane Roe, sued the Attorney General, something Wade of Texas. The federal court ruled that it was unconstitutional, and it was ultimately appealed. It went to the Supreme Court, where it was ruled that no state can ban abortions before viability. This ruling is justified by a right to privacy that's supposedly found in the 14th Amendment. I say supposedly because it's not explicitly said there. They talk about it as a penumbral right, but that's a whole philosophy of law question. Let's stick to the bioethics. But this isn't supposed to be an unqualified right. The government has the ability to impose certain regulations. States, really can't interfere with a woman's choice during the first trimester. This is, being pushed by the, laws of Mississippi and Texas right now, but this is what the ruling was, at least before. States can impose some regulations during the second trimester. We'll get into a little bit of the regulations in a second. But no state or states then can also outlaw abortions during the third trimester. These are, late-term abortions. So the 14th Amendment doesn't clearly define what a person is. This also is another business ethics class question, where it's what is a corporation? The law called them persons. And they also appealed this weird 14th Amendment thing. But ultimately, the law never really maintains that unborn people or unborn fetuses have the same full moral status as a person. Again, this is justified based on the right to privacy, based on the privacy between a woman and her doctor. Okay, so the regulations I was talking about, I think this can happen during the second trimester, or just generally what they can and can't do with federal funds. So since Roe, the courts have upheld that women might be required to give her written informed consent before an abortion. The government is not obligated to use taxpayer money to fund abortions. Parental consent or judge's authorization might be, required of minors under 18 who are seeking an abortion. States can forbid the use of public facilities to perform abortions. So this would be like a state-run hospital. They might make an exception for saving the woman's life. A woman's consent to an abortion might be required to give a 24-hour waiting period, a cooling off period is sometimes what they call it. And then states can mandate the women be given abortion information as they're going into the abortion clinic. Now, so the standards set by the courts have been that, abortion restrictions cannot place an undue burden on women seeking an abortion of a non-viable fetus. The restriction imposes an undue burden if, it has the purpose or the effect of placing substantial obstacles in the path of the woman seeking an abortion, especially of a non-viable fetus. Okay, so that's the law, the legal access. We're going to set the law aside, and we're just going to talk about the philosophy now. So the abortion debate, like most debates, is commonly framed in terms of, three segments. We're going to have the conservative, the liberal, and the moderate. These are similar to these political terms, and sometimes they correlate to the political terms, but we're just using them, we use these terms in philosophy to label different extreme views. The conservative on one end, the liberal on the other end, and the moderate in the middle. All right, so what does this mean for abortion? So a conservative is going to say abortion is never morally permissible. They might make exceptions for saving the mother's life, but the unborn is a full human being, a full person from the moment of conception, and so has the same full moral status as a human being, as an adult human being. The liberal view is that abortions are permissible whenever a woman wants one for whatever reason. The unwanted, and it's, the unborn person or the unborn fetus is not a person and does not have the same moral rights or full status as an adult human. The moderate view is that some abortions are permissible, but not all. So most people have probably heard about the conservative and the liberal points of view. We'll go over those and the arguments for them. It's about personhood and when it develops and whatnot. But a lot of people probably haven't heard about this moderate view. So, and I feel like a lot of people are more moderate about this. So we're going to try and get into the more, nuanced view there later on. That's what we're going to do in the next lecture, looking at Judith Jarvis Thompson's article, A Defense of Abortion. But first, so all three sides are going to, agree to some basic moral principles. First, murder is wrong. I think we should all agree with that. That persons have a right to life. And that personal freedom should not be curtailed except for very important reasons. So we agree with these three principles, right? Murder is wrong, persons have a right to life, and personal freedom should not be curtailed except for extreme reasons. So the fetus is the moment, the argument that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception, and people are usually going to, trot out this argument. Killing the innocent human being is wrong. The unborn is an innocent human being. Therefore, it's wrong to kill the unborn. In other words, abortion is immoral. This might look like a valid argument, but critics are pointing out that there seems to be an equivocation here between premise 1 and 2, how the word human being is being used. In the first premise, it seems like human being is, being used to refer to full human agents, what we might call persons, whereas in the second premise, human being seems to be referring to something that's biologically human. They're maybe not full human, adult humans in the same moral sense, but yet they're biologically human. And so because they're using the word in different ways, this isn't going to be a valid argument. It's going to show you why you can reject either premise 1 or premise 2. I imagine most people would reject premise 2. Really, you're just rejecting the connection between premise 1, 2, and then the conclusion 3. The conclusion 3 here doesn't follow. And again, the reason is because of this fallacy. This is the fallacy of equivocation between one sense of the word human being and the other sense of the word human being. Okay, so this doesn't totally have to be it. And we'll get into the distinction between human being and person more in a little bit too. But for now, just understand what that distinction is. But the conservative might respond and beef up their arguments. That way it doesn't have this charge of equivocation. So they might propose this argument. Killing an innocent person is wrong. The unborn is an innocent person from the moment of conception. Therefore, it is wrong to kill the unborn. Again, abortion is immoral. So this is going to be a better argument. This argument isn't going to suffer from the same equivocation that the last one did. But this one's going to be a little bit more controversial, especially premise 2 here. Liberals are going to deny it, and conservatives are going to have the charge of why should we support this premise? Why should we think that an unborn is an innocent person from the moment of conception? So the conservative approach here is going to be this line of argument that is there's no clear cutoff point. And so because there's no clear cutoff point between the moment of conception and when someone does clearly have this full human agency, that we need to treat everyone along the way as if they have full human agency. So, because there's no clear line between when a person goes from not being a person to when a person does being a person, because there's no clear line, it's going to be arbitrary, and any point we choose is going to be, unsupported or not very well supported at least. And so they were going to reason that, life begins at conception. Personhood, full personhood, begins at conception. So the liberals are going to respond and say, just because there's no clear line does not mean that there's no real difference between the two states. Think about a tadpole and a frog. It's a slow transition and development from tadpole to frog, but there's a clear difference between a tadpole and a frog. Same thing with an acorn and an oak tree. It's a slow transition, and there's no clear line where we can say, oh, this is definitely an acorn and this is definitely an oak tree, there's a clear dividing line between them. So just because there is no clear line doesn't mean that we need to, agree with their conclusion. So some philosophers are also going to argue on the empirical grounds that the zygote can't be a person. Mainly because it's not even decided whether it is a single person or two persons. So how could it be one person? So this is the idea that the zygote could still further divide, and at some point you could become twins or triplets or quadruplets or whatever. And so because there's no clear point, you can't say that this one thing is identical to two things later, because they're twins later. Because you can't make that argument, they're going to say that the zygote isn't a person at all. All right, so that's an interesting argument. I'd never seen that one before. If you want to look into that one, write a paper on it, definitely. I think that's an interesting idea and an argument. So the conservative is going to respond that the fetus might not be a person, but maybe it's a potential person. Maybe we could understand it as this potential person. So murder is wrong not because we're taking away someone's life, but because we're taking away their future. And so the same thing is happening in an abortion. You're not taking away their life. They don't have a previous life before that, but now you're just taking away their potential future. That's going to be a decent argument. Don Marquis is going to make that argument, I'm pretty sure. Of the conservative arguments, that one is one of the more well-reasoned ones. I definitely like that one. But the liberal can respond to that and say, look, there's a difference between, possibly possessing a trait and, that giving you a right that actually possessing the trait would have. So, we can think about this like, someone has the possibility of being a Supreme Court justice, but we shouldn't treat them as if they are a Supreme Court justice. We should only be treating the Supreme Court justices as if they're Supreme Court justices. So it's like, just because someone has the potential for life doesn't mean that we should treat them as if they have the full rights of someone who is a full human being. Just because they have the potential of becoming a full human being doesn't mean we should treat them as if they have the rights of being a full human being. So Tuli's going to give this really interesting kitten example. It relies on the premise that killing a kitten is okay. So this might not be very convincing to you, and that's okay. But the idea is that, like, so if we want to, like, think about this idea of personhood, and we'll get into personhood again in a second. But so if we had a way of giving a cat personhood, a little kitten personhood, by injecting it with this medicine, as it's slowly developing into personhood, it seems like it would be just as fine to kill the cat then as it would be as it's developing into personhood. So again, this relies on the idea that it's okay to kill the cat in the first place. So it's not super convincing to me, but the idea is that, like, just because it's slowly going to grow into something that might have human agency doesn't mean that we can't still treat it the same way we would have treated it if it didn't have the potential to then grow into that agency. So others are going to criticize this idea of, potential futures as being self-undermining. A single-cell zygote is going to have the potential for personhood. Well, that's going to mean that all single cells are going to have the same rights, and that's not really something that's going to make sense. Like, a sperm cell isn't going to have a right to life. That doesn't make sense. An egg doesn't have a right to life. It's not murder when, Okay, so that's going to be one other liberal response to this idea of the potential future. So on the other side, let's now think about the liberals. They're going to claim that the fetus is not a person, and that killing the fetus is then not murder. So why is it that the liberals are going to be able to claim this? Let's get them surfers. So the liberals are going to claim that the fetus is not a person from the moment of conception, and so killing the fetus is not murder. But why and how are they going to be making these claims? So one of the main reasons why they're probably going to be a liberal might make these claims is the idea of this idea we've been talking about, a person versus a human being. And so this is going to come into play when we're talking about speciesism. So a human being is just any person, a human being is any being that has human DNA, what makes us biologically us. Whereas what makes a person is going to be, certain cognitive abilities and thinking and things like that. So DNA isn't going to be sufficient enough for personhood. So one way you might think about this, if we had extraterrestrials show up, they might be human moral agents, but they clearly aren't persons, right? Or if all of a sudden dolphins could talk, and had a lot more moral sentience and moral grasp and more clear cognitive abilities that we can communicate with them, then we might call them persons. So another thing, Superman, right? He looked just like a person, but he wasn't from Earth. He wouldn't have Earthling DNA. He would have Kryptonian DNA, right? But yet still he's a person. He has the same moral status as a full adult human being who's not mentally impaired or anything like that. So if we assume that an entity is a person because of their DNA, this would be speciesist. This is the idea of favoring one species as opposed to another. We don't like that. It's like racism or ageism or, something like that. It's discriminating against a group because of, certain biological features. This is discriminating against a group because of their DNA, their human DNA. Or I guess lack thereof. So a fetus is not going to have the characteristics that qualify them as a person. This is why the liberals are going to make this argument that they're not people. They're not persons, to be clear. More strict, use that word. So, but which traits are, what counts someone as being a person? Marianne Warren is someone who famously gives 5 criteria that qualify someone as a person. 1, consciousness. 2, reasoning. 3, self-motivated activities. 4, the capacity to communicate. 5, the idea of self-concept and self-awareness. So you don't have to have all 5 of these traits to be a person. Maybe, maybe not. These just seem to be like signs of personhood. But she's, really making the argument that something that doesn't have any of these 5 is definitely not going to be a person. So if you're a conservative and you're looking for an argument, something to do your paper on, Marianne Warren's paper is definitely a really good paper I would definitely suggest checking out. Okay. So to Marianne Warren's response, or to Marianne Warren's 5 criteria, the conservative might respond. And again, this is, maybe a paper idea, but the idea would be the standard of personhood is going to be too high. So it's going to exclude the cognitively impaired individuals, people with dementia, mental retardation, schizophrenia, which means that they're not going to have a right to life, which suggests that it would be morally permissible to kill them, which is kind of crazy. So, maybe we shouldn't have these criteria as personhood. So Marianne Warren or, any liberal might respond with this defense that, even though they might not be persons, we might have other reasons for not killing them. So just being a person, you're not allowed to kill persons. Maybe you're allowed to kill other, person-like people with schizophrenia, but, oh no, that's also ruled out by other considerations, by, the fact that other people care about them. Or the idea that, this might cause such harm to society. The idea of letting unnecessary killings go by, it's going to just start devaluing human life. Another idea is infanticide. So this is an objection to, I think, Marianne Warren's idea. So a fetus isn't almost indistinguishable from a newborn. And so if it's permissible to kill a fetus, then it should be permissible to kill a newborn. So this is the idea is saying, infanticide is if abortion is morally permissible because of these 5 criteria of personhood, a newborn's not going to satisfy any of these 5 criteria of personhood. They're probably not going to satisfy it for, some of those traits don't develop for a while. The ability to communicate, that's at least a year. So it's like, could we kill a baby for the first year? It's, if this criteria is required for abortion, for personhood, then a child isn't going to have personhood according to these standards, and so maybe abortion might be permissible. Yeah. So Marianne Warren, she wrote her own postscript in her own paper about infanticide, and she's going to say that it's rarely permissible. So she's actually maybe fine with infanticide occasionally happening, which I guess might be really euthanasia for children who are so impaired that life would be, really not worth it. There's a couple really sad diseases of children being born without brains and just never being able to fully develop and only at most living to 2 years old. And it's like you're changing the diaper for something that is going to die and never fully develop. And it's like, whose life is really better in that situation? Okay, sorry, so maybe infanticide is allowable. I'm not going to argue for that, but really, again, it might just be, euthanasia for younger children maybe is another way of thinking about allowable infanticide. But again, this is going to be because other people, value the infant. The infants have moral standing because of other reasons. One of it is because of other people value them, but also because they're person-like in a certain sense. They require special justification in order to kill them. They're like dolphins or whales or chimpanzees or, other highly person-like creatures. I don't know if she's going to appeal to that defense. It seems like, well, if the infant, is going to be person-like, then the fetus a couple days right before birth is also going to be very person-like, right? So shouldn't we... Anyway, Joel Feinberg's going to argue that infanticide, or argue against infanticide on utilitarian grounds, saying that not only does, not killing them bring better social utility, but, then we don't have to be cold, callous towards babies, which obviously, being cruel to a child is not good for their upbringing. Babies are going to suffer if they're, put in a corner. So yeah, we're going to have more social utility if we're not, allowing infanticide, if we're not cruel towards infants. We should, we're going to get more social utility if we're warm and sympathetic towards babies instead. So these have been the conservative view and the liberal view, going back and forth, talking back to each other. But there's still a moderate view of ranges in between. Most claim that personhood begins somewhere between conception and birth. The viability or the moment of the fetal brain waves or fetal heartbeat are some possible other points in which the fetus develops personhood. Other moderates might argue that the moral standing gradually increases of the fetus over time. So those are moderate ways of approaching the idea of personhood and whatnot. Next, we're going to talk about Judith Jarvis Thompson. We're going to briefly talk about this. This is going to be an entire lecture next week. I think she has a really good moderate view, and so we're going to cover it briefly here and then go into it fully next week. So she's going to try and avoid the entire debate that was in the last section. She's going to grant, for argument's sake, that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception. But she's still going to try and conclude that at least some abortions are morally permissible. And I think she does a pretty good job of this, at least. So it's not, a right to life is not absolute, and it doesn't entail the right to use someone else's body. And then she's also going to say that, killing itself is not wrong. It's more a matter of unjust killing that is what's wrong. So she gives us this violinist example. So you wake up one morning and you find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist. This is a very famous violinist. You might not know him, but trust me, he's famous. He's been found to have a certain fatal kidney ailment. And the Society of Music Lovers canvassed all the available medical records and found out that you and you alone are the right blood type to help out. So they decided to kidnap you. And last night they plugged the violinist circulatory system into yours. So that way your kidneys can be used to extract the poison from his blood, as well as your own. So the director of the hospital then comes up to you and says, look, we're really sorry that they kidnapped you and that they did this, but we've never permitted, we never would have permitted it if we had known this was going to happen, but still, they did it. And the violinist is plugged into you now. To unplug you would really just be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. Just hang in there. By then, he'll have fully recovered from his ailment, and we can unplug you from him then. All right, so this arrangement is probably going to strike you as outrageous. It totally should. It is kind of outrageous. So, but this is supposed to be analogous to a pregnancy. So, the fetus's right to life does not give the fetus a right to exploit the mother's body. The mother also has a right to self-defense. In the same way that, the violinist is an adult human being. No one's disagreeing that they're a person, that they have a right to life. But, that doesn't give them the right to exploit the mother's body. It doesn't give them the right to exploit you in this situation for, curing their kidney ailment. Also, you have a right to self-defense. You have a right to unplug from them. So she's going to argue that this really justifies abortion in situations of rape and at least failed contraceptive of situations when the mother is not consenting to getting pregnant. We're going to get into that argument more next week. But critics of that argument are going to say that this really is only going to justify abortion in cases of rape. If she voluntarily consents to sex, even if she's, trying to prevent pregnancy, but she still gets pregnant, she's obligated to carry the fetus to term. Others are going to claim that there's some sort of special relationship between the mother and child that's going to obligate her to carry it to term. So because she has this biological relationship between her and the fetus, she has this special obligation. Again, we'll look at that argument as well next week, or not next week, but in the next lecture. And so the unborn has a natural claim to the woman's body because of this biological relationship to her. All right, on to the major theories. Utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, and natural law. What do they say about abortion? So now we're going to apply the major ethical theories. First, we're going to start with utilitarianism. So utilitarianism can justify abortion by appealing to the greatest happiness principle. You know, something is right if it produces more happiness than it takes away. You know, the net happiness. You know, it's the greatest happiness for the greatest number involved. When we see how much pain and suffering women experience when they're not really in control of their reproduction, this is a clear cost to society. So involuntary childbearing aggravates poverty. It's going to increase infant and child death rates, and it's going to place severe strains on limited resources for families and states already. On top of that, an unwanted pregnancy might cause emotional risk, emotional distress, or risk of complications, or death in childbirth, disruption of employment or education, or other life plans, or generally unhappiness about losing control and personal freedoms. Anyone would be upset if they had their life taken away for 9 months. That makes sense. So utilitarianism can also justify abortions by considering the quality of the life of the child who would be born. So, if they would be born into a low-income family, then it seems like maybe utilitarianism could justify that abortion. But if they'd be born into a well-off family, a family that, could take care of them, that loves them, that, is financially stable, but they still get an abortion anyway, maybe utilitarianism would justify that abortion, because the life of the child in that circumstance would be high. So again, it depends on how the calculations come out, whether utilitarianism is going to justify abortion. But then also you can justify legal access to abortion, in the same way, utilitarianism, talks about autonomy, using Mill's harm principle. We can't interfere with a person's capacity for self-determination, except for maybe to prevent harm to them, and that's only in certain circumstances, right? Talked about that with paternalism in week 1. So then utilitarianism can also be used to justify arguments against abortion. So abortion might, cause a woman distress, but once the baby is born, it's going to bring great joy to her and her family, or maybe even just it's going to bring great joy to the family who adopts it. So yeah, that's something you need to think about in terms of utilitarian calculations. So even if the woman is, let's say her pregnancy causes her 10 unhappiness points. I don't really know what that means, but just for comparison. But then the couple's happiness derived from actually raising the child is, let's call it 1 happiness point for each year. Let's call that, 18, happiness points. So their 18 happiness points are going to outweigh the mother's individual 10 negative unhappiness points. It's going to, cause this, she should have the child because they're going to get so much happiness out of this. So when you're doing utilitarian calculations, you can't just think, what's the greatest happiness for the person, the individual? You have to think about what's the net happiness for the society as a whole. So if one person has to suffer for 9 months, so that way this couple can be happy for 18 years, then utilitarians are going to say that one person is maybe morally obligated to suffer. And, maybe pregnancy isn't, I'm not going to say that. Okay. So then Kantian ethics can also go either way. It kind of depends on whether a fetus is a person. If a fetus is a person, or if a fetus is not a person, then the woman has a right to exercise her autonomy. But if the fetus is a person, then they inherently have moral worth, and so an abortion is going to be impermissible. On this view, on the Kantian ethics view, you may not use other people as a mere means to an end. This is the idea of using people. We all know what it means to use someone. It's a bad thing. Now, you might think you're using the waitress to get your order, but you're not using her as a mere means to an end. It's unethical when the other person isn't really, implicit on it or not getting any benefit out of it. The waitress is getting something out of it. She's getting paid, she has employment, or should be getting more out of it, but she's getting what she's getting. But yeah, so you're not using the waitress in the same way that, it's unethical to use someone. There's examples. What's coming to mind right now is it feels like Cartman, every time he is interacting with Butters, he's using Butters as an agent for his end. He's not wanting to shoot the person, so he's having Butters shoot the person. He's using Butters as a mere means to an end. So that's something that's definitely outlawed on Kantian deontology and ethics. So if your abortion is for these kinds of means, if it's about disrupting your personal life, then that's going to be using the fetus as a mere means to an end. You're using the fetus as a way of escaping what might happen, or you're using abortion and killing this person as a way of absolving yourself, or trying to at least. But that's not going to be allowed because you're using a person as a mere means to an end. You're doing something immoral according to the Kantian. Again, take Phil 4, you'll get way more into Kant and the ethics there, and hopefully that'll make sense. But so definitely on the therapeutic abortions, these are going to be abortions that are done to save the mother's life. These would be on the Kantian grounds justified because of the right to self-defense. It might also be argued that aborting the fetus with severe birth defects justifies the abortion because it's going to have such a miserable life. This is what we talked about earlier with, maybe justifying infanticide if, the child is born without a brain. Encephalopathic, I think. I'm definitely saying that wrong. Or Tay-Sachs disease is another one that's really sad. But yeah, so those ones are the kind of life that the child might lead. Kant would justify sacrifice or the abortion in that instance. It would be therapeutic for the child's own life. Okay, so then natural law theory. This is going to be the ethical, framework that the church tends to rely on, the Catholic Church in particular. It's most clearly articulated by the Catholic Church, and it's pretty clear and unequivocal about abortions. It's impermissible. The fetus is a person from the moment of conception, and so killing the fetus would be wrong. It would be impermissible. Thus, even therapeutic abortions might be impermissible. So the idea here, again, so this is an abortion to save the mother's life might be impermissible. So the idea here is that the doctrine, the idea here is that, there's a distinction between killing and letting die. And so, you're killing the fetus in one instance, whereas you're just letting the mother die of pregnancy and the complications in the other instance. And the letting die is possibly better than killing the fetus. So they are going to even say, look, therapeutic abortions might be impermissible on this case. That's going to be following the natural law. Like the law of nature chose this person to die from pregnancy and complications in pregnancy. And the doctor might be playing God by interfering in that case. Okay, so there is maybe one loophole, though. So the doctrine of double effect permits indirect killing. So this is often used in war to justify why, like, an innocent person might get killed. But yeah, so this would be like a procedure that the mother has to go through, where they know the side effect is going to be that the fetus is aborted, but they're not trying to do that in a certain sense. So it's a unintended but foreseen effect that the fetus is going to die. Again, there's only going to be a few situations where this might fit the bill. So we have ectopic pregnancies. This is going to be where the zygote will implant inside of the fallopian tubes as opposed to the uterus. This is a serious problem for the mother. And the baby can't grow in the fallopian tube, so the baby's going to die as well. So they're both going to die. And then instance of uterine cancer. That would be another instance. Okay, so today we talked about abortions, and we talked about pregnancies. We talked about what it takes to and causes the end of pregnancies. We talked about who's getting them, which demographics of women get abortions, what are the reasons for getting abortions. We talked about the legal access and struggle to abortions. And then we surveyed the three main moral theories for the permissibility of abortion. First, we had the conservative, abortion is never acceptable, maybe accepted to save the mother's life. And this is because the fetus is a full human being, has full moral status from the moment of conception. And this is again because there's no clear cutoff between the fetus and a full human person. Then the second position is going to be the other end of the extreme. Abortions are acceptable whenever a woman wants one, and for whatever reason. The fetus does not have the same status as a person. Being biological, and again, the reason for that is that being biologically human is not enough for personhood. So they have to show some sort of cognitive signs that they're, moral agents. And again, all three sides are going to accept it. 1, murder is wrong. 2, persons have a right to life. And 3, personal freedom should not be curtailed except for in extreme and important situations. It's like, so they all agree with those 3 things, but yet they're still going to disagree about the moral permissibility of abortion. And then lastly, we looked at utilitarian and Kantian ethics, how they might approach these questions. Specifically, they might approach it with the idea, their answer is really going to depend on the considerations taken into it, how you're doing the calculations, what matters, but then also whether the fetus is considered a person or not. Natural law, on the other hand, is going to give a clear answer. Their position is that abortion is impermissible almost in all circumstances. Again, there are going to be few circumstances where it's going to be permissible to save the mother's life. All right. So I don't have any questions to send you off on to think about. I guess you've probably not seen it laid out as conservative, liberal, and moderate. You've probably really just seen the conservative and liberal view. So I want you guys to think about, I imagine most people are moderates, and so I just want you to reflect and think about, what, if you are moderate, that means that some abortions are permissible, but it also means that not all abortions are permissible. So I want you to think about where and why you're going to draw that line. Which abortions are permissible, which aren't. Is it about rights? Is it about personhood? Is it about the mother consenting in certain ways? So just think about that, and I'll see you guys in class.